Lesson 12, SIAM Practices Part 1, People and Measurement Practices. Welcome to Lesson 12. In this lesson, we'll introduce the concept of practices, and then look at some of the practices associated with these areas. Managing cross-functional teams, enabling and reporting on end-to-end services. Within the SIAM Foundation body of knowledge, a practice is defined as the actual application or use of an idea, belief, or method as opposed to theories relating to it. In other words, practices are things that organizations do to make SIAM real. Over time, all the SIAM layers will develop practices that help them to work more efficiently and effectively, and these may vary from SIAM model to SIAM model. Organizations will develop practices related to people, to processes, to measurement, and to technology over time as their maturity increases. We're going to study an example from each area and then look at some associated practices based on the experience of organizations currently using models based on SIAM. Effective SIAM models rely on relationships, so practices related to people will be very important. Examples of areas where people practices are required could include managing cross-functional teams, managing conflict, creating shared goals. We're going to study managing cross-functional teams as an example of an area where people practices will need careful attention. For each of the areas we'll study, we'll describe it and then look at the associated challenges and practices. Let's start by thinking about what we mean when we say cross-functional teams. You can see a definition on screen here. In most organizations, practices related to managing cross-functional teams focus on a team made up of staff from different departments in the same organization. In a SIAM ecosystem, we need practices that recognize that staff might come from different organizations. The boards, process forums, and working groups that we've already studied are all examples of cross-functional teams with members from two or more of the three SIAM layers. For example, a continual improvement forum could include staff from the customer organization to help identify the business impact of an improvement, staff from the service integrator to coordinate improvement activities, staff from the service providers to suggest improvement activities and plan for their execution. There are some challenges related to managing cross-functional teams, and there are some practices that can make organizations more effective in this area. Click on Challenges and Practices to learn more. You can see some common challenges related to cross-functional teams here. Conflicting objectives and a reluctance to share knowledge can be much more common in a SIAM ecosystem where the team members come from different commercial organizations. Lack of automation can mean that it's very difficult to pass information between organizations. Collaboration tools can help to build an effective team if the team members aren't all in the same place. If each organization is using its own tools, the team will feel less connected. We're going to study 5 practices related to the management of cross-functional teams. You can see them on screen here. The service integrator and the customer should take the lead in establishing and creating practices, and the service providers need to participate and be prepared to collaborate. The first practice associated with managing cross-functional teams is having clear roles and responsibilities in place. Policies and principles for roles and responsibilities are drawn up during the discovery and strategy roadmap stage, before detailed roles are added during plan and build. If everyone understands their role and how it relates to other roles, teams will be more effective. RACI matrices are useful tools to help map roles and responsibilities. They're used to map who is doing what for a process, an activity, a service, or a team. For each task, the matrix is populated to show responsible. Who is responsible for doing the task? This could be more than one person. Accountable. Who makes sure the task is done? This role is never shared. Consulted. Who might have information that is needed to get the task done? Informed. Who needs information about the task? We'll add an example of a RACI matrix to your study guide, but why not spend some time creating one of your own? Another practice associated with managing cross-functional teams is having clear goals and objectives. These cascade down through the SIAM layers. The customer organization sets objectives, which are then translated into contracts and service agreements. The service integrator then works with the service providers to make sure the objectives are met. It is very difficult for cross-functional teams to work effectively if they don't have a clear picture of what they're supposed to achieve. The next practice associated with managing cross-functional teams is to allow access to shared data, knowledge, and information. The service integrator will create a knowledge management strategy to govern how knowledge is gathered, processed, presented, managed, and then removed when it is no longer useful. You might have experienced frustration in your own role when you've had to work hard to find something out only to find out that someone else had easy access to that information. You can imagine the impact this can have on relationships between team members working for different organizations. It might sound like stating the obvious, but communication is essential for effective cross-functional teams. The RACI matrices we mentioned earlier in this lesson can be used to help support communication planning. At a minimum, consider the who, what, when, where, how, and why within the SIAM layers. A communication plan is used to identify what communication needs to happen, to track that it has happened, and to monitor the effectiveness of communication. Finally, toolset integration is important to help build effective cross-functional teams. When toolsets aren't integrated, data might need to be re-entered into different tools by each organization. This wastes time and can lead to errors creeping in. The practice of entering data from one system into another is often referred to as the swivel chair approach because it mimics an operative turning from one system to another in their chair. Time to take a break and do a quick exercise. Plan to spend 10 minutes on this exercise, and don't forget to check out our suggested solution. We've been discussing how to make cross-functional teams more effective when they span the SIAM layers. In many organizations, these teams are also virtual teams. In other words, they don't work in the same office or spend any time face-to-face with each other. What advice would you give an organization to try and help them create an effective team that is both virtual and crosses the SIAM layers? Make a note of at least 3 suggestions you would give. We've looked at some practices associated with people in a SIAM environment. Now we're going to look at some practices associated with measurement. Specifically, we're going to look at practices associated with enabling and reporting on end-to-end services. End-to-end service measurement means the ability to monitor an actual service, not just its individual technical components or providers. Reporting on end-to-end services within one organization can be challenging. Reporting across the SIAM layers is even more challenging. We'll study some challenges related to enabling and reporting on end-to-end services, and then some practices that can make organizations more effective in this area. Click on Challenges and Practices to learn more. You can see the challenges associated with enabling and reporting on end-to-end services here. You'll notice that there are lots of potential areas for challenges to occur. Lack of strategic requirements means that the service integrator doesn't know what to measure and report on. Service providers not sharing information, inability to map workflows, and not measuring the right amounts of data and information are all related to the service integrator being unable to measure what it needs to. We're going to study 4 practices related to service reporting. As we study each practice, think about what is in place in your own organization and whether it's effective or not. You can see the practices we'll study on screen here. The first practice is to create a performance management and reporting framework. This will take data and information from all service providers and consolidate it to provide an end-to-end view of how services are performing. This sounds like an obvious thing to do, but in reality can be very challenging. Service providers might be using different tools. Contracts might not specify what information needs to be provided, and building the end-to-end view can be a complex task. Reporting needs to provide information that is of more value than the time it takes to produce the report. Otherwise, it is a wasteful activity. There are different ways to structure the performance management and reporting framework, so the service integrator will need to decide what is most appropriate to meet the customer organization's needs. The framework can be structured in 3 ways: by SIAM ecosystem layer, service provider, service integrator, and customer metrics; by type, people, process, and technology metrics; by hierarchy, strategic, tactical, and operational metrics. The most appropriate structure will be designed and implemented as the SIAM roadmap progresses. Another effective practice is to make reports visual. Using reporting formats like dashboards and scorecards allows reports to be understood at a glance. If reports are presented in long chunks of text, there's more chance of them being ignored and vital information being missed. Do you use visual reporting formats in your organization? When visual reports are used, it's important to check regularly that the report recipients fully understand what they are being shown. A mixture of qualitative and quantitative measures can also help reports to be more effective. Qualitative measures are descriptive, subjective, and often relate to the perception of a service, for example, customer satisfaction surveys. Quantitative measures are numerical, objective, and factual, for example, service downtime or service targets achieved. Using a mixture of qualitative and quantitative measures provides a balanced view of how a service is performing. Using a mixture of measures avoids a scenario referred to as the watermelon effect. This is a term used to reflect service reports that are green on the outside, red on the inside. The watermelon effect happens when a service provider's reports show that it is meeting all its targets, but the customer isn't happy. This is usually an indication that the service targets are measuring the wrong things. Within a SIAM ecosystem, the service integrator would work with the customer and the service providers to remove or reduce the amount of watermelon reports. Finally, applying some agile thinking to reporting can help to make it more effective. In this situation, reporting starts small, with a set of minimum viable metrics, and then adds more reports as required. This approach allows for discussion and learning, optimizing reporting and measurement using regular reviews. It will reduce the likelihood of the customer organization being overwhelmed with too much data, and reduces the time wasted producing reports that no one reads. That's the end of Lesson 12, where we've studied practices associated with managing cross-functional teams, enabling and reporting on end-to-end services,